As a Generation X kid, growing up was filled with memorable moments and experiences. You know, times when you roamed the neighborhood with your friends unsupervised until the streetlights came on. Well, today, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Many of the things that were considered standard back then would raise many eyebrows and maybe trigger a call to social services in today's society. In this video, we will explore the wildest and most hazardous things Gen X experienced, which will make you wonder how these kids even made it to adulthood alive. Let's get right in. Number 1. Car safety. For a very long time since the first car was invented in 1893, not a single car had seat belts in them. So Gen X kids usually rode in cars with their heads out of the window and waved excitedly at passers-by. Although it was a fascinating thing for them, it wasn't the safest. And today's generation would agree 100%. With seatbelt laws and accident risks, children cannot be seen doing such today. Moving vehicles with reckless drivers could have swung rapidly at some of them. The little ones could even slip out of the moving car while sticking their heads out of the vehicle's window. However, none of these things were a concern for the Gen X kids and the adults who watched over them at the time. Even when the US government mandated that every car made after 1968 should have safety belts installed, making proper use of them was more of a recommendation than a necessity. So, Gen X kids were free to stand upright in the vehicle, looking over their dad's shoulders, who is mostly the designated driver. Excitedly, with the parents trying to control the noise and happiness from their kids. Another thing Gen X kids would do is take turns lying flat on the back dashboard of the car, getting excited by the police car behind them, or when their dad slammed the car brakes, which would make them fall forward into the car seats. These kids had to master the art of taking a fall. What's crazier is that they'd always try to get back up to the dashboard, knowing that they would have to brace themselves for another colossal fall. This dangerous yet exhilarating experience was the norm until the mid-1980s, when the use of seatbelts became a requirement by the law. Today, children under the age of 4 must be properly secured in a car seat system at the back seat of the vehicle. When the child turns 8, they must ride in a booster seat, and failure to comply with these rules would attract a hefty fine. Number 2. Walking to school alone. As a Gen X kid, you probably remember walking to school in groups and chatting away about the day's events on your way back home. One thing that was amazing about those times was the freedom to journey to school with your friends as you all happily walk through the early sunrise. Then, on the way back home, there was time to play around, picking up stones and sticks from the ground. Sometimes these kids would race each other on main roads, not caring about the oncoming traffic as their excitement only mattered. These kids were exposed to a lot of dangers, ranging from kidnapping to injuries, from hurling stones and sticks around, and even worse, road accidents. They were also subjected to minor accidents, like bruises, scratches, and head bumps from all that running and jumping. What's more, most Gen X kids may remember getting home to an empty house. No parents or nannies were in sight, and very few even had nannies at the time. Popularly known as latchkey kids, Gen Xers had no support or supervision after school. The bigger kids would mostly spend after-school hours hanging around at 7-Eleven parking lots and smoking freely without a care in the world. Speaking of smoking, let's take a look at the next dangerous experience. Number 3. Cigarettes. Since smoking was allowed everywhere, in parks, airplanes, malls, libraries, movie theaters, and even doctors' offices, practically everyone was indulging in the habit of smoking. Even if you didn't want to, you'd somehow find yourself inhaling some of the bits from your neighbor at the office because everyone could smoke in there too. Parents also subjected their children to secondhand smoke in their homes or cars, as practically every parent was smoking. They would sometimes even drive their kids to convenience stores to buy cigarettes while they waited outside in their car. In situations like these, the salesperson would look out the store window to receive a slight nod from the adult in the car as a go-ahead to sell the cigarettes to the kid. This enhanced the will of most youngsters to try some when their parents weren't looking. Since they had to get confirmation from an adult to buy cigarettes, some of these kids would forget signed notes from their parents and present them to the salesperson at the store. Hence, many Gen Xers were introduced to smoking at a tender age, and they could get away with it because no one cared. Such can never happen in this present century. Number 5. Outdoor activities. One thing Gen X kids maximize to the fullest is the summer holidays. This is the period when every kid plays non-stop on both weekends and weekdays, especially since there wasn't school the following day. This period also meant that you could spend a lot of time with your friends, whom you don't get to see much. One thing is for sure. All of that catching up and fun would take place outdoors. Parks would be filled with children running around on the playgrounds, sometimes under the supervision of their mothers. But there weren't enough parks at the time, and the long distance to the park would often discourage most parents from sending their kids there. So, the children mostly had their playtimes in the neighborhood. After long hours of running around, yelling, and releasing so much adrenaline, the kids are bound to get thirsty. Back then, there was nothing faster and more refreshing than drinking water directly from the garden hose. In today's world, such an act is considered unhealthy, as there are concerns about lead contamination in older hoses and the potential for bacterial growth. But who cares? Xers had only one thing on their minds: to quench their thirst without having to go in for a drink while also doing that very quickly so they could go back to flying kites and playing with sticks. Another thing that today's generation would disagree with regarding this garden hose is the slip and slide. A long, thin plastic sheet was usually attached to the garden hose, providing enough wetness on the sheet for the kids to slide on. Many kids broke their bones or had 1 or 2 chipped teeth from playing on the slip and slide. Nonetheless, it was a form of entertainment for kids who enjoyed playing with water. Believe me, it still exists now, but in a safer design. Number 6. Lumbers in moving cars. Unlike today, pickup trucks were not as common in the past. People would haul heavy objects, including their Christmas trees and their boats, behind their cars, dragging them all the way home. However, in some situations, it wouldn't be sane to drag drive some of these objects home. One of them is lumber. Whenever the dads needed lumber, they would usually stack them on top of the car, pulling more of it to one side so they could tie it on one end. However, it was still the responsibility of the kids to hold on to the other end by standing upright in the car and grabbing each end to prevent the lumber from falling over. When picturing this type of situation, we can all agree that it is an extremely dangerous thing to do. But, like always, these thoughts never crossed the minds of the parents of Gen Xers. Instead, they thought of grabbing onto their children's shorts while also holding the lumber on one side, at the same time managing to steer the car in the right direction, shifting the gear, and smoking a cigarette. Now you see why it's a mystery that these Gen X kids made it to adulthood alive. Number 7. Medium of watching TV. Although cable TV was invented in 1948, many households only had the means to get one much later. Hence, what was in vogue was a television antenna shaped like long rabbit ears with tin foil. But this is not even the worst. Some families used antennas mounted on top of their house roofs. The most annoying thing about this antenna was how the wind could easily sway it, disrupting the signal multiple times. Back then, the dads, who of course were in charge, would sit right in front of the TV while the kids were mounted on the roof, waiting for instructions on how to adjust the antenna. At the time, no one ever thought of the dangerous position these kids were in, as they could slip and fall off, shattering their bones or snapping their necks. The kids were happy to be on top of the roof anyway. It was the only way they could get a clear view of the whole neighborhood and also stargaze. But we cannot deny the hazards of such a situation. Thankfully, we do not have to deal with rabbit ears antennas anymore. Plus, sending your child up onto your home's steep roof would be child abuse in today's world. Number 8. Baby cribs. One would think that even if parents of Gen Xers were not strictly watching over their kids and subjecting them to secondhand smoke, they would at least ensure that their babies and toddlers were safe in their cribs. But the opposite is the case. A lot of Gen X kids slept in drop-side cribs, which were one of the most dangerous things used back then. This baby death trap, crib featured plastic hardware that could easily break and cause the drop side of the crib to detach from a corner of the crib. This creates a space where an infant or toddler can easily roll into, causing entrapment and, if not quickly noticed, strangulation and, eventually, death. Back then, there were several reports of babies and toddlers suffering from strangulations, falls, and suffocation due to this crib system. Thankfully, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, came to the rescue sometime in the 2000s to get rid of these death entrapments disguised as baby cribs. They set strict standards that must be met by manufacturers who are in the business of making baby cribs, which include stronger mattress supports and crib slats, extremely durable crib hardware, and rigorous safety testing. Number 9. Unstructured playtimes. One of the best things about Gen Xers' childhood was the freedom to play as much as they wanted. In fact, many Gen X kids would attest to this being one of their favorite parts of being a child back then. Let me describe a Gen X kid's typical day after school or on weekends. There would be about 10 to 12 kids within a 6-year range living on one street. These kids would always go out to the street, running after each other through the narrow pathways between various homes, blocks, and even forests. All they would do was yell and play around until dinner time, when their parents would yell their names or whistle from the porch of their homes. Many times these kids would go back outside to have some more fun even after dinner. Many parents did not see the need to structure their playtime, as they were even happy to let them loose. In the modern world, parents are having highly supervised and structured screen time and playtime for their kids. Some of them even plan their children's days, adding extracurricular activities like piano lessons or swimming lessons to keep the kids away from having too much fun, all the while mastering new skills and building their intellect. Nowadays, letting children loose to play on the streets whenever they pleased meant subjecting a child to danger. With the increase in missing person reports, parents in this modern world would want to avoid taking the risk of letting their kids roam around freely. Number 10. Fire building or fireworks. Speaking of unsupervised, another thing Gen X kids did without an adult batting an eye was making outdoor bonfires for fun. Even more, fireworks were sold and allowed everywhere, just like cigarettes. Every child could pop them off anytime they pleased, as it was legal, and there wasn't much fuss about it, unlike today. At some point, these fireworks were used to scare people, and kids used them to scare each other. You know, these things make loud sounds and can get anyone, even the most brutal man, shocked. You would typically see young boys set up fireworks in their toy trucks and roll them toward a group of giggling girls playing in the neighborhood just to get their attention. It was quite a childish thing to do. But hey, they were kids. Today, fire safety concerns and the potential for wildfires have made fireworks and bonfires a more supervised activity in the United States. Number 11. Inadequate to almost no sun protection. Remember how we mentioned that Gen X kids always loved to play outside and mostly spent summers outdoors? Yeah, they did that without putting on sunscreen. Heck, no one even knew what sunscreen was at the time. Only the very few who were highly cautious would make use of SPF 4, which provided little to no protection from the blazing sun. Children of those days were completely sunburnt, but who cares? What you don't know won't kill you, right? Instead, they would compare sunburns at the end of the day. The sun did a lot of damage to their skins, almost peeling them. Innocently, Gen Xers would compete after a very long day of fun and getting sunburnt to see who could peel off the most flakes from their skin. It was also common for young girls to lay under the sun just so their skin could be tan. Some of them would sometimes try to speed up the tanning process by rubbing some coconut oil or tanning oil on their bodies before laying almost bare under the sun. In the modern world, mothers would practically bathe their kids in sunscreens with nothing less than SPF 30, avoiding any tanning signs by all means. With the advent of sunsticks, it's even easier to apply sunscreen every few minutes constantly. Number 12. Kite fighting. An admirable trait in Gen Xers is their ability to have fun and find happiness in the simplest things. Things as simple as making long chains from the can, pulls of soda drinks and beers, dragging it behind them as the chain improvisation would make screeching sounds, which excited them. If you had seen these kids playing with these things, you'd think that they could easily get cut by the can pulls. But just as they did not care about that, they also didn't care when they got involved with blades while kite fighting. Wondering how that happened, kite fighting was one of the most common ways that Gen Xers had fun in those days. Each child would make a kite with razor blades attached to the sides and fly it while trying to cut each other's kite strings with the blades. If the string of your kite, unfortunately, got hit by the blades, you would have to quickly run far away from the kite's path to avoid getting cut or injured by the blades on your kite. But that's not all. These Gen X kids played with a literal double-barrel gun, commonly known as a BB gun, excitedly and without caring about their safety. The kids who owned one would go around town strutting like dangerous cowboys and mafia lords, ready to shoot their next target. The BB wars were a hit back then. Number 13. Biking without helmets. Commonly known as Huffy, bikes in those days were every child's most cherished possession, as they had the utmost level of fun with them. From riding for hours far away from home to jumping over everything they could ride over, these kids were always just one wipeout away from cracking open their skulls. They would typically set up blocks and place plywood on them so they could ride over the plank to jump high up in the air with their bikes. These kids performed all of these extreme acts without a single helmet. Back then, people who used safety gear like helmets and knee pads were an exception, and not because they were following a rule. Those who were seen with the full gears, covered from head to toe in a helmet, knee, wrists, elbows, arms, and shoulder pads, were made fun of and called nerdy or geeky. To them, it was better to get hurt a little than to be made fun of. Despite knowing that they could get hurt, these kids would lay flat on the ground as the bike rider rode over the makeshift ramp. On many occasions, the distance between the ramp and those lying on the floor was not measured correctly, so the bike could accidentally graze. Or, in worst cases, the rider could land straight on the kids on the floor. All of this would be happening with a parent on the porch, waiting to see who gets hurt first. Gen Xers were involved in batshit crazy things, many of which could have gotten them killed or permanently disabled. Despite the dangers that were hovering around these kids back then, they did have so much fun doing many of those things. It was a period when neighbors would hang out in each other's homes, and everyone could rely on each other for help. We've come to the end of today's video, guys. What do you think of some of the activities Gen X kids were involved in during their childhood? If you are a Gen Xer, what's one core memory you have of those times? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.